Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Expert Witness with Doug Miner and Steven Palmieri. I am Steven Palmieri coming to you live here, and we have credit expert witness Doug Miner as well. Doug has been in numerous court cases, more than you can count on these hands and toes and feet, as a qualified expert witness for credit issues, assessing damages. Doug, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us, buddy. What's going on in your world in beautiful sunny California?
Yeah, it's a great day. I'm glad to do this and happy to kind of get into it. From the other shows that we've done, I'm ready for this one.
Rock on. So for those of you guys who are watching live, obviously we're kind of monitoring the little chat feed here with the questions. So feel free to chime in your questions, and we'll make it kind of interactive. And apart from that, let's kind of go ahead and dive in. So, we want to bring you guys good quality content that can help you with your credit repair business and take it to the next level. And Doug Miner kind of cut his teeth doing mortgages back in the day, and then he became a credit repair guy. And then one day an attorney called him and was like, "Hey, can you help me assess damages on this thing?" And he did it, and they paid you. And then you were like, "Oh my gosh, what just happened?" I think that was an expert witness, right? So that's how it started. And now you are basically a full-time expert witness. And for those of us that do credit repair, we're already experts. So now we just have to figure out, if we're motivated, how to kind of do expert witness as an additional income stream and credibility thing as well. So I guess let's kind of talk about, let's say somebody's, wanting to do this, and they may have a few attorneys that they've already spoken to, and the attorney calls and says, "Dear Doug, I've got a case." So let's kind of talk about from the time that the phone rings till the time, I guess, you do the engagement with them for that case. What does that look like, Doug?
Yeah, I think you want to start out with, if you get that phone call or when that phone call comes, it's what's happening on the other end. What's the objective of the attorney on the other end during that initial call? And I think for the credit people out there that are receiving that call, they have to remember that and treat it similar to a job interview, because essentially that's what's happening. They're interviewing you to see how you're going to respond and check out your credibility, how you communicate. Is there even more so, even take it further to the beginning of it, that when that call happens, do you have a receptionist that picks up every time and is professional and courteous? Do they get you? Does that receptionist get the phone to you in a timely manner? Do you pick up in a respectful way? When they communicate and ask you about, your qualifications, are you able to clearly, articulate that? But during that initial call, the main thing to do is to just act professional, be professional, and have your structure set up as being professional. And I'm assuming, and they can type in or ask questions or whatever if they want, but I'm assuming that if they own a credit repair company, these sort of things are already set up. They have a receptionist that picks up, or, if somebody calls, you're going to pick up the phone on your cell phone, right? And so when they do call, and one of the first things that you want to do is, how are you doing? Yes, this is Doug Miner, and I'm such and such attorney. I'm looking for someone. This is my case, and you just need to stay quiet and listen to about the case. Ask them, what they're looking for. What are they looking for the expert to do? Because this is where it really varies. Sometimes attorneys will know what they're really looking for because they've had cases, they've had FCRA cases. They're calling from representing a mortgage servicer. So they know what's going to happen. They've had lots of cases like this. And then the reverse of that is you'll get a actual consumer. I've had an actual consumer call me and say, "Listen, I have this problem. I've spoken to my attorney, but he doesn't know or doesn't even know what we do exists." Meaning he's never done a credit case before, and he's tasked the plaintiff in his own case to find the expert. And I know that sounds a little strange, but I can't tell you that's happened so many times where the plaintiff themselves, the consumer, has called me and said, "Hey, I'm trying to find somebody. My attorney, says I need to find someone to do this." And
And
then once, yeah,
you've got your website, dougminer.com, where you basically advertise this part of your business, the expert witness. So, I mean, is that kind of where a lot of this comes from, this traffic?
well, again, so now it's sort of switching gears as far as how to market yourself and how to get these calls. Is so there's different ways of doing it, and if anybody wants to hit me up on Facebook or email me, however they want to get in touch with me, either through the websites too, I can give them a list. And essentially, the business comes in a few different forms. Those calls a lot of them come from expert witness directories that you can find online. And there's a handful of them that are reputable and that attorneys use, at least from what they've said to me. And typically you'll put your profile in there, where your expertise is, what you can, types of cases that you're well suited for, and it'll run you, I'd say, $300 to $500 per year per directory. So if, let's say you're in 4 or 5 directories, it's going to run you $2,000-3,000 to do so. Then there's also these directories where they're a brokerage service. So if Steve Palmieri is on their site and an attorney comes to them and says, "Hey, we're looking for a credit expert." "Oh yeah, we have Steven Palmieri." Well, Steven charges $300 an hour. But what they do is they'll bill you out at $400 or $450 an hour. And so they make the difference between what you get paid and what they're actually charging the law firm. They take care of the billing and they take care of the retainer agreement, all of those sorts of things. So, and then I'd say the third way, probably the third pillar of that would just be standard searches, let's say by a paralegal or somebody there in the office, or even solo attorneys or small practice attorneys. They'll say, "Yeah, I Googled for this and I found you on this website, or I found you here, or I found your website," kind of a thing. And that's how they find you. Or they're a referral. That might be the other way. So there's numerous ways to do it, but that's kind of those are your 4 basic ways that those calls will come.
Yeah. So, where you are now in your business, when you get a phone call from an attorney, I mean, most of the times, do they have a pretty good idea of here's what they need and you're kind of qualified to fit that? Or do you still have a lot of attorneys who call you up and they're like, "Doug, I've got this case and here's the fact pattern and I need an expert, but, is this within your skill set or is this not really something that you think you can help me with?"
Yeah, so literally, before the show started, you and I were talking about it. I had a case this week where the phone call came from the attorney, and the attorney, it was a case that he was actually personally involved in, so it was his case for him. And he said to me that he did mostly like car accidents, right? That was personal injury attorney, and he didn't know anything about what I did, had never heard of it. And he tried to look around and he found me and I started talking to him about it. He'd been in a car accident. The mortgage servicer that held his mortgage was reporting lates. And from what I could ascertain from that call was he had set up an impound account when he originally took out the mortgage. And it seemed as though from talking to him that there was some misappropriation or maybe miscommunications about the escrow account and the amounts and so forth. And so he ended up with 120-day late on his report. And they actually ended up foreclosing on the property. And so he was trying to get his property back and wanted to know how he was damaged and if the reporting, if any of it had been done was inaccurate, right? So he didn't know anything about credit reporting expert witnesses or damages calculations, and he was most interested in the damage calculations and how could we quantify it to the judge. And so I had to educate him on basically how he needed to set up his case and where he was damaged and what it was worth. So he was literally ground zero. Like, he's like, I can't believe I found you. You're the only person I could find that even knows anything about this.
Well, and it's a small ocean out there, isn't it, with credit reporting expert witness. We were talking before the show today, and there's probably really less than 10 that are out there in the marketplace, which means that there's a lot of opportunity for folks, especially credit repair folks who may want to, step into this arena. There's a huge opportunity for them to be able to do that because it's kind of like just a wide open arena. And, why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are so few qualified experts in the credit reporting section out there?
To speculate, it's a good question, Stephen. I'll try and answer it. I obviously I don't know for sure, but I think it's a newer area. And it's weird for me to say that after doing this for more than 10 years, right? Like, it's still like this. I'm just telling you, I have an attorney call me, doesn't know anything about it, right? And the plaintiff's father was also an attorney doing family law, and he'd never heard of anything like me. So there's a large, I'm going to assume that there's a large enough number of attorneys still practicing that don't even know that these types of cases exist, or that there are people like myself who can handle it. That might be one part. And maybe, gosh, stumping me a little bit. I'm thinking, I'm just thinking about.
No, but it's just interesting. I mean, there's a huge opportunity is really what it kind of comes down to. And I think that's part of why we do this show. I mean, because it is, even for us in this industry, it's an interesting topic. You don't really get to hear about this and talk to folks who are out there in the trenches, in the courtrooms like you, that are working on these cases and stuff. And so, and I guess, really there's different types of attorneys when you have to figure out, like, how do you market your business? I mean, you've kind of got, a general attorney who, I mean, I guess they have their own little specialties and stuff, but there's a lot of general attorneys that just kind of, they'll do a little bit of anything, right? And then, maybe if a credit case comes their way, to your point of the person you were talking to, they had no idea about anything. And that's totally understandable. And then, of course, there's the consumer protection attorneys, the ones who really specialize in this arena. And I think those are the ones probably where, once you've got the relationship, that may be kind of where your bread and butter comes in. But I mean, if you had to kind of take a stab at it and estimate, do you get a lot of calls just from like attorneys who aren't even really consumer protection attorneys that just had somebody walk in their door, or, one of their existing clients? Or is a lot of what you get folks that are in the consumer protection arena that are calling you up?
Yeah, that's interesting, Stephen. I try to answer similar questions this way. The makeup or the breakdown of types of cases that I work on, the two that stick out the most to me are typically family law cases, divorce cases, where one spouse has harmed the other's credit, and they need someone to come in and quantify what the damages are. That's probably number. And along with family law, it's mortgage litigation, whether it's a mortgage servicer, like this other case, it's a misappropriation of funds in the impound account, so you end up with negative reporting, wrongful foreclosure, like this case I just described to you, sort of kind of what could be the epitome. It's credit reporting. It's how they handled the money through the escrow accounts, how it was reported. And obviously too, because of my background in mortgages, right? So mortgage and credit kind of go hand in hand, and the damages portion of it, typically some of the largest damages in the cases I work on come from damage are mortgage related. That's where the biggest numbers typically come from. But outside of that, like you're saying, consumer protection companies, it could be wrongful termination cases. I want everyone to sort of imagine or think about, like, anything that sort of affects your life where someone's credit could be affected. So wrongfully terminated, now they don't have a job, they can't pay for everything, now they have late payments. Or personal injury, right? You get in a car accident, you can't work, you can't pay your bills, the settlement hasn't come, and so now your credit's screwed up. So things like, it just really have to think outside. It can be breach of contract. So it's still fascinating to me after over a decade of doing it, the types of cases that come and how it comes about.
Have you ever had anything like security clearance type cases, like perhaps folks that maybe are in the military or work for the government and they've got security clearances and they pull their credit and maybe either they were a victim of fraud or maybe they had their own issues with their credit, but where speaking of employment, they had some sort of a negative impact from their employer, either fired or maybe demoted or lost their security clearance. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that?
Yeah, actually, I did have a case up in Central California, and it was I don't know that this really matters, but she spoke about it. So it was a woman. She was Asian, and she was up for a promotion through uh, a government agency and had been working with the government agency for a very long time and making a good six-figure income doing what she did. And I guess I knew, no, you're going to have to forgive me. I don't know the rankings system within the
Sure.
government, whether it was a colonel or a general, I can't tell you, but some higher up in the government had come in, and she was let go without, in her opinion, proper cause. And her reasoning was that he wanted to appoint and put another white male in this position. And so that was what, so yes, government related, wrongful termination, possibly discrimination, and yet losing a job with a six-figure income, and now you can't pay for things. So yeah, it comes in all forms. It really, like I said, it's really surprising. And I think, like we talked about before the show started, I'd seen some statistic, let's say, just to do easy numbers, let's say there's more than 10,000 of these types of cases, credit related cases that are filed each year. Well, those 10,000 cases potentially need an expert on both sides. So essentially 20,000 opportunities. And like we talked about, let's say for 10 people in the whole country.
Sure.
So 10 people
Yeah.
is supposed to cover 20,000 cases or 20,000 assignments.
You do the math on that, right?
Yeah.
Now, what about, a lot of people, we deal with Equifax, Experian, TransUnion pretty much. I mean, that's really the bread and butter of what we deal with. Maybe sometimes credit repair folks will deal with LexisNexis, maybe check systems, but really the big three bureaus. But, as we're talking about employment, there's a lot of these specialty credit bureaus, and a lot of them are localized as well that keep employment information. And it can be almost impossible if something from an employer gets placed into one of these specialty background check type credit bureaus. It can be really difficult to find that. I actually had a client once. She was actually referred to me from an attorney, and I did a little work with her, kind of got her disputed and papered up, and then sent it back to the attorney, and he filed the suit. But she had worked for a local hospital, and basically the hospital wanted her to do stuff that was illegal / unethical, basically like report things that were contrary to like I think the doctor messed up, and she was like, well, I'm not gonna, and they wanted her to kind of cover up for it, and she was like, well, I'm not gonna cover up for it, and they terminated her. The hospital terminated her,
Wow.
and she's like an RN or a registered nurse. And then this is a big local, we would call them credit bureaus, consumer reporting agencies, but they specialize in the medical industry employment background is what they are, but they are a consumer reporting agency. And all the major local medical facilities, if you're anybody in the medical facility area in that industry, here locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area, all the big dog employers pull your background from this particular company, right? This consumer reporting agency. And so she had this notation in there that she was terminated, like fired for failure to follow instructions or something like that. And she was like, well, I mean, it's totally misleading. It's totally wrong. They wanted me to like lie and stuff like that. And so we ended up, we got the credit file disclosure from this local background check company, and we disputed the information, put it in the form of an affidavit and stuff where she could tell them, hey, this isn't really true. I and that's kind of where it's an interesting thing, because technically, yes, she was terminated, for failure to comply. But the whole reason why she was because they wanted her to falsify records and things like that, right? So and her damages were that, so she had been fired and she was a pretty well paid registered nurse, and she could not get employment in any other comparable type local facility because they all pull from this background. So she was relegated to like, working at these little lower level, paying medical facilities and stuff as a result of that. So it was really crippling her ability to get meaningful employment. And anyway, so I had worked with her in that case, and then went back to the attorney, and he filed suit, and they ended up settling and getting it resolved with the credit bureau and stuff. But it's a really interesting thing when you think of, right? Because we're sitting here saying, credit experts are a rare breed, yet, and there's so much opportunity out there for folks who have experience. To have certain levels of specialty where they can jump into the expert witness arena. I mean, if somebody's got experience in the medical field or in the employment field or in HR, right? Your background is in mortgages. So, I mean, you can take a look at these mortgage cases in your sleep. But what about the folks that were like wrongfully terminated or, have information in those employment credit bureaus, consumer reporting agencies? They need to have expert witnesses who can kind of understand that lingo and that jargon and stuff. And so,
Well,
kind of from where you are, I mean, do you see a lot of stuff in that peripheral type, specialty type consumer reporting agencies, or is mostly what you get the big three credit bureaus coming through your front door?
well, a couple of things there, Stephen. The case you're describing, right? Um, Her loss in wages, right? Seems like an easy damage calculation. She was making 100,000 and now she's making 50 at the lower level places for whatever period of time. The credit itself, part of the negotiation or the litigation would be to correct the information or to suppress it or delete the information. Um, and so a couple questions there as far as that goes. I'm curious as to what she ended up getting. And then as far to answer your question directly, yeah, I do see, like, I thought, I do really want to get that across, is like you're bringing up another type of situation. So the cases are more varied than you could ever imagine, because you just never know. When someone says, hey, my credit has been messed with, and a lot of times it has to do with what they do for a living. If you think about it, right? If it's a business owner, a small business owner, or a large business owner for that matter, if their credit is damaged in some way, and now any of the creditors do account reviews, and now their credit gets cut or declined, or they cancel the cards. And I had a case where this couple ran a business. They ran about $1 million a month on their revolving credit. Then the credit happens, and now they can only get access to 100,000 a month. So their income had decreased by 90%, literally, figuratively overnight, because now they didn't have access to get the products, ship them out, and just run through their normal business like they had been, because the creditors shut off their lines or reduced their limits. So you see things like that where it's sometimes it's outside. It can be outside of a lot of people's abilities to make a business calculation like that, or they don't feel comfortable about it. And maybe you need to bring in somebody to fill that gap as far as the damages are concerned. But as a credit expert, you can definitely opine about the fact that if this showed up, this is typically what will happen. What's happening to this plaintiff, I see on a daily basis in my practice.
That's a really interesting scenario, and let's talk about that a little bit because, credit card companies and lines of credit, things like that. I mean, they use risk-based pricing, and they have the ability to adjust the terms. I mean, I guess correct me if I'm wrong. This is what I want to talk about, but I mean, they can adjust the terms. I mean, I guess as long as they're not like discriminating against one particular borrower. But if they look at their portfolio and they're like, oh well, look, a pandemic just hit, and we've got this $1 million credit line, and all these, and we don't want to have this exposure, so we want to chop them down. Where does the liability come in when a credit card company just reduces your limit? I mean, don't they have the right to reduce the limit without any sort of liability to them? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So you bring up an interesting question in that, first off, I'm not an expert in credit card law as far as the way that those agreements are drafted, but my understanding is that, yeah, they do have the ability to do that during their account reviews. If you've gone from an 800 credit score down to a 590, or they see all kinds of lates and so forth, yeah, of course they're going to reduce their exposure or cut your limits and do those, or close the accounts, right? When you were asking that, I sort of thought back to when we had the financial crisis, let's say 2008, and you saw mortgage lenders cutting off access to people's home equity lines of credit. And I remember at the time specifically because I was in the credit business and I was still had my foot in the mortgage business, and my wife was a CFO or COO for a mortgage company at the time, mortgage banking firm. And we were talking, and we had an equity line on our home. And so what we did was we took all the money out of the equity line. And then sure enough, shortly thereafter, I don't know if it was a month or 3 months, sometime thereafter, they cut off access to it. But we'd already taken out all the money, so we had the money. So I think in numerous different ways we've seen, whether it's a credit card issuer or somebody issuing a line of credit or home equity line of credit, whatever the terms are in those agreements, it does allow them to have permissible purpose to do account reviews and check on your credit, and the ability to modify the terms. So we
Well,
all,
like, so in this scenario where you just described, there's a business owner, and I think you said he had 1 million, I think, if I heard, and he went down to 100,000. I mean, so what were you able to do for that? I mean, where is the liability in that instance?
so keep in mind, and this is kind of a key point. Keep in mind, when I am retained on these cases, I may not know all the particulars about the case. They're asking me to assess the reporting that's being done, the impact to the individual. Is it accurate? And then what are the damages? A lot of times, right? So first off, should whoever reported the negative information, is that accurate first and foremost? What And I think the way I go about that, it goes back to what we were starting to talk about in the beginning, in that initial call, finding out about the case. And I tend to like to be able to read through the complaint, understand, kind of get a bigger whole picture of what the case is all about, and what piece of it what part of it I'm taking part in, and how it may or may not affect what's going on. Um, so with that information and knowledge about the case and what specifically they're asking me to do, and that's kind of the key thing as an expert witness. This, you hear it all the time, you have to stay in your own sandbox. You don't want to go outside of your area of expertise. So stay anybody who wishes to do this type of work, make sure you define what you're going to be doing, and stay within that. Don't venture out, because if you venture outside your box, you're going to most likely get hurt.
Well, now, I mean, through your 10 years of doing this, though, would you say that like your sandbox just naturally gets bigger, though?
Yeah, sure. I guess that's a fair assessment. Yeah, as you gain more experience and you see more cases and you gain more knowledge, your sandbox is going to get bigger. Sort of a natural progression.
Let's talk a little bit about, I guess, how Metro 2 fits into this. One of the big things, obviously, that, my whole philosophy is the pre-litigation philosophy, and, disputing in a way where you use their own industry standard as the source of the judge of what's accurate or not. And a lot of people don't even realize, but Metro 2 is an industry standard for their data format. I mean, so there is actually a standardized format for how stuff should report. And so, as you're out here looking at credit reports, I guess to start with, you're probably going to pull the bureau reports either from annualcreditreport.com, or either at the portals online at the bureaus, or maybe write and have them mail them to you. I mean, are you going to deal with a report, a full file disclosure directly from the bureau, or do you use other reports sometimes as well?
That's a great question. As far as these cases are concerned, sometimes the case is fairly recent. Maybe it happened in 2020, but some of these other cases could be from 2016 or 2017. They can be from years past. And depending upon in the call, and I'll put a checklist of information I'm looking for. And so you may get multiple different types of credit reports and multiple different credit data from different sources, right? Consumer sources, old mortgage credit report, old auto loan credit report. And one of the things that I do on a fairly regular basis, I ask them to pull a FICO 3B score report from myfico.com. And the reason I do that is those reports are, let's say, relatively easy to understand, right? They're color coded, sort of USA Today newspaper type, easy to read. They're consumer friendly. But what's great about it is it has 28 different FICO scoring models on it. It has industry specific models, auto scores, mortgage scores, bank card scores. And so if you have to testify in front of a judge or at a deposition or in front of a jury, being able to explain and essentially teach them that there's all these different models that are out there, and that each, depending upon the model being used, it could affect the consumer one way or the other. Or the underwriting guidelines associated, like in mortgages, right? They use industry specific old scoring models in mortgage lending, and they use all three. And so you have to be able to understand how the scoring models were back, 10 years ago or more, and how the underwriting guidelines that are in the mortgage industry apply to credit situations. That's what I do, right? That's my
Yeah.
area.
Let's talk about those mortgage reports, those tri-merge reports. Those come from kind of these intermediary credit bureaus called resellers. They basically, when the mortgage company wants to get a report, they don't go to the big three bureaus. They use their reseller, their intermediary company, who instantly pulls that data and then merges it and kind of gives you this tri-merge type output. And so the thing with those tri-merges, though, like, I mean, it's really hard to tell what the source of the data is, which one of the three bureaus, because it merges it all into one row. And so, but you see errors all the time. I mean, you'll see reports like with late payments, there'll be like no 30 and no 60-day payments, but you might have like 3 90-day payments. Well, clearly you can't go from like no 30 and no 60 to 3 90-day payments. There's clearly an inaccuracy there, but you don't really know like which of the bureaus or if it's on all the bureaus. So when you're looking at those mortgage reports, how are you able to, I mean, I guess I'll ask it this way. I mean, if I'm the big three bureau and I've just been sued and you're standing up there saying, well, yeah, this is wrong. If I was the attorney for the big three bureaus, I would say, well, but Doug, I mean, how do you know this came from us of the three bureaus? How do you know it didn't come from that bureau standing right next to me? Because this is a merge report. Do you have that situation? And how do you work through that?
I can't say I've had that absolute specific situation, but as far as on a tri-merge RMCR, residential mortgage credit report, it will show in each trade line that's on there when they merge it, it'll show which bureaus the information is coming from. You'll see a TU or an EFX on let's say one trade line and maybe just a XPN on another trade line. So it'll tell you if it's being pulled from all three or two or one bureau where the information is coming from. But you're right. When the reseller, like a Credco or Informative Research, one of these resellers merges the information, I think when that happens, there's a possibility of overlap and there's a possibility of maybe not seeing everything. I think you have to assume that you're not seeing you're absolutely not seeing everything on the report from all three bureaus, right? And so for you, I guess I would say it this way: it rarely comes down to just one credit report, right? One tri-merge report. So in the cases I work on, there's typically multiple credit reports that you go through and analyze from different time periods. And then how am I going to say this? When you listen to the plaintiff and you understand the complaint, and where a lot of times I will speak directly with a plaintiff if I'm on that side, and ask them from their point of view, where were they damaged? How were they injured financially? What happened to them? And they'll tell you because they lived it. They know the time frames. And during August of 2018, I didn't get this job, or I had to pay in, October of 2019, I had to pay 16% for this car loan I have now, right? So you have to be able to understand the real life ramifications of it, use the reports that you have that may not be ideal, but you can derive enough information out of the reports from different timeframes that you have. So
Now,
yes, yeah.
yeah, so a little bit of an art form there, and you just got to kind of work through it. A lot of the attorneys that I talk to that are currently litigating, because things change all the time, obviously, as far as case laws and how the judges are viewing things. But I mean, like in the scenario that we just talked about, where you may have 0-30, 0-60, but then you may have 90-day late payments. Okay, well, if you dispute that and you're like, dear credit bureaus, your payment history is inaccurate because, well, first of all, it violates your own standard of measure too. But secondly, it's illogical. You can't have like 0-30, 0-60, and then 90. So please fix it or delete it. And they come back 30 days later and it's still the same. So during that 30-day dispute period, kind of in the spirit of the FCRA, they've got the ability to correct it, right? And in that case, if they corrected it, they would have actually made your credit a little bit worse in theory, because they would have added a 30 and a 60 right before the 90, so now you have like more negative than less. But in reality, if they didn't fix it, what they should have done was deleted the trade line. Like, that's kind of the way the law is written. And then so from these attorneys, I kind of hear them say that, they've got to kind of sell it to the judge, because the judge is like, well, I mean, so Mr. Consumer, did you want them to make your credit report worse? And it's like, well, no, judge, they could have, but they didn't, so they should have deleted it. So it's not like we're upset because they didn't fix it. We're upset because they didn't fix it and they didn't delete it. And so from your perspective, kind of where you sit, obviously you're not litigating, you're assessing damages and things like that. But I think it's a relevant topic. It's like, there's kind of that point where the whole point is it should have been deleted based on the way that the FCRA is. So yes, their credit would have been made worse, but they didn't make it worse and they didn't fix it. And so we're not talking about the current condition that this thing is still reporting, and it's still reporting better than it would have otherwise been reporting. We're talking that because they didn't fix it, because it's still reporting, that in fact is the problem, because it should have been deleted. How do you handle situations like that where, like, the judge may, well, I mean, I guess from your perspective, where, like, do you find situations where judges kind of look at the cases sometimes and they're like, well, but I mean, the alternative would have been a worse credit report, and you're like, no, judge, the alternative is they should have deleted it because they didn't fix it. Do you have situations like that, or is that not really the kind of scenarios that you run into with your cases?
I'd say a part of what you're talking about, I feel like I come across, right? The part where you're trying to explain to a judge what's happening. And so and I think another step further, what I typically look for, or like to see in a case where there's been a dispute filed, I want to see the ACDV exchange, right? I want to know when it happened, what codes were being used in what field, so I can point it out. To your point, in a case like that, if I can go to the ACDV and say, well, listen, they have the wrong code in here, or it should have been done this way. And to your point, if it wasn't corrected, it should have been deleted and so forth. I haven't had that specific with a judge, but explaining to a judge what is happening, it's just, I guess I would just equate it to you or I explaining to any lay person what goes on. I think you have to take this position of, and so I forget who told me this or where I learned it, right? Essentially, you're a teacher. You need to try to be able to teach these people what's going on so that everybody can make a fair assessment of, if there's damages, and if so, are the methodologies and calculations that I'm making supported, and do they make sense?
Since for those folks who may not know, like you mentioned, ACDV, that stands for Automated Consumer Dispute Verification Form, which is basically the automated way. So when the consumer sends a dispute to the bureaus, they have a system called eOscar, which is basically an automated mechanism for transferring disputes from the bureaus to the furnishers. And eOscar has like about 30 codes or so, and they can select a small handful of those codes from what they, so they take your letter, all like million different variants, and then they distill it down into a one or two or three of these choice of 30 codes, and they'll push those codes over to the furnisher. And so that's kind of what Doug's talking about. But let's talk about that a little bit, because it used to be, back when you and I got into this industry of, well, the credit repair industry, since you did that before you became an expert witness.
Yeah.
It used to be that when you would send these disputes to the bureaus, all that they conveyed over to the furnisher was just those ACDV, those eOscar codes. But now I understand that the bureaus scan everything, and they actually send images of the dispute letters to the furnishers as well. And so that being said, how relevant is the code? I mean, because we can take an assumption that, okay, I mean, if you've got millions of disputes, and if it's purely just a couple codes that the bureaus are sending over to the furnisher, they're not really conveying all relevant information, which is what the FCRA requires. But if now they're using codes, but they're also transferring an actual image, like a PDF type image of the dispute letter, um, do you still find that those codes are as relevant, or is that a good defense from the furnishers, or I mean, even from the bureaus, to be like, well, we may have used like a wrong code, but we also sent them the image of the letter, so your argument is kind of like baseless. Is that a situation you've run into, or what is your thought in general on that?
Yeah, I can't say that I've run into a specific situation where um, that's happened. But what I would say is, or where I have seen, let's say, is closely related to what you're talking about, is I'll have a copy of a letter, dispute letter that the plaintiff has sent to the bureaus. I'll have a copy of an ACDV exchange. So you could match up the dispute letter with the ACDV exchange and make some correlations between the two. And in many cases, the ACDV is returned back to the bureaus from the data furnisher with no changes to it, right? At all. So it's just a matter of each case, and if you have access to that information, did they subpoena that information, or are they going to during discovery? And so sometimes you're not going to have that information. You're only going to have credit report data from multiple different sources to go through.
Let's talk about that ACDV. So from, I mean, what percentage of, I mean, if we're talking about like how do we even frame up the question? What I'm really trying to ask is, how many cases do you rely on that ACDV, or do you want to see it? I guess it depends upon the kind of case that you're dealing with. If it's a dispute that you're arguing didn't get handled, but then I guess almost all these cases that you're on would probably involve a prior dispute at some point in time, would it not?
I would say the majority of the cases in some form typically will have a dispute, but don't get me wrong, there are cases where maybe a consumer had only disputed the information directly with the furnisher over the phone.
Yeah.
So you don't have the dispute letter, you don't have the ACDV to look at.
Well, but there was still a dispute, though. It was just an oral, not a written
Correct.
mail dispute. Yeah. So I
Correct.
mean, do you try to? I mean, is that ACDV important to you almost across the board, or are there a handful or even a significant number of cases where you don't necessarily really care about that as part of assessing how things may have gone wrong?
Yeah. So if you think about it, there's, let's say, a divorce case, right, where one spouse is given the marital home, but then stops making the payments, and it ends up on both of their credit reports, right? So there's no need for an ACDV exchange. Why is there's no reason to dispute the information? It's all accurate. If
Right.
you're
That's not really
right.
necessarily a credit bureau issue. That's a spouse issue, right? Like the spouse violated the divorce decree, and so the spouse is the one really who's liable for the damages. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. So to your point, do I need an ACDV every time? No. Is it required? No. But in many cases, if disputes are filed, I would like to see them, sure, because I think it typically just supports the case. Whichever side you're on, it's going to help clarify the factual points in the case.
It is pretty common that your attorneys will get that during like early stages of discovery, or I mean, are there some cases where the bureaus push back really hard? Let's talk about the process of getting those ACDVs. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, you're bringing up an interesting point in that I think, like we started in the beginning part of this, where if it's a law firm or if it's, let's say, a law firm representing a mortgage servicer or representing the credit bureaus, in those particular cases, it may be more likely that you'll see an ACDV if a dispute has been filed, right? There are numerous times where I can recall I've been retained by the plaintiff's attorney, and the attorney doesn't know what an ACDV is, has never heard about the exchange, and doesn't have any knowledge of the Metro 2 format of any of these types of things. And so you have to try and educate the attorneys that have hired you and ask them to subpoena a copy of the ACDV that you believe exists, right? And sometimes you'll get it and sometimes you won't.
How do
But
they
yeah.
get around the ones where they don't get it? I mean, do they usually settle those cases before they go to trial? Because I would imagine that if it's not settled, you would want to figure out a way to get that ACDV form.
Yeah, well, I guess that's in its most simplest form, that's an easy question to answer, in the sense that I've learned early on, and I think it's a sort of a general rule of thumb that people understand, is that typically only around 5% of cases actually make it into the courtroom as far as a trial is concerned. So to answer your question, the probability is low that it makes it to a courtroom, right? Do they settle time?
I mean, there's got to be a reason why they're not wanting to give it too, right? It's kind of like, I mean, they're not playing poker and like that's their poker face. There's a reason they're not wanting to give you the ACDV, probably because they looked at it and they were like, oh, we completely messed this one up. Which, I mean, have you seen ACDVs that are just absolutely the codes that they've used? Well, let me back up for 1 second. So what's the maximum number of codes you've ever seen on an ACDV? I've heard you can only do like up to 3. Is that about right?
No, I mean, gosh, well, when you say that, it kind of strikes me a little bit. At the different ACDVs that I've reviewed, there's multiple different fields and multiple different codes, far more than 3.
Let me rephrase my question. Yeah, I think I kind of probably, so yeah, the ACDV is the form with all the fields. You're right, where
Yeah.
they put the corrections. So I guess what I was really trying to ask, I just worded it wrong, was when the Bureau initially sends the eOscar codes to the furnisher, that form right there, I guess would that be the universal data form, or is that not an ACDV as well?
So you're the automated universal data form, an AUD?
Is that what it would be like? So when when the Bureau receives the consumer's dispute, they're going to pick a couple of the eOscar forms, or a couple of the 30 eOscar codes, and they're going to submit those codes to the furnisher, right?
Yeah.
So
So let me answer that. I think I want to not confuse anybody listening or watching this. The ACDV exchange and an AUD, totally different forms and used in completely different situations, right? As far as any eOscar codes that are contained on a ACDV, I've never been asked to sort of figure out how many are on there. So I can't answer that question right now. I don't know the answer to it. I might have to go back and look.
So let's build on that then. So I would think that it would be valuable to find out what codes the bureaus submitted to the furnisher. And so is that not really subpoenaed in the cases that you deal with? You're really more dealing with the responses that the furnishers give back to the bureaus?
Well, so 2 things. One is the ACDV exchange. You're going to see how it was sent out and how it comes back. It has fields for both. And then in particular, depending upon the case, I may be focusing on a particular field or 2 that relate to how it's being reported and what the issue at hand is. So there may be other things on an ACDV that I may not pay as much attention to because it's sort of general data. When the account was opened may not be an issue for me in the case, or the date of first delinquency may be an issue for me, and I really need to focus on the timeframes and when it happened. So I'm not necessarily focusing on just the issue that you're asking me about. How did one of the bureaus send out the ACDV to the furnisher? And then, but typically I would say this, the ACDVs that I do review typically are ACDVs that have been sent out and have come back and have both how the information went to the furnisher and how the furnisher sent it back. Because that's what we want to see. If they filed the dispute, part of it is how the bureau sent it off to the data furnisher, but more importantly, how did the data furnisher respond to the dispute and what did they use when it came back, or if they changed it at all?
What if the furnisher, like the issue that I see is, what if the furnisher didn't really properly receive from the bureau the consumer's dispute? And that goes back to what we were saying earlier, where now they do scan the letters and send them to the furnisher, but back in the old days where they would just take a couple of the eOscar codes, and they're like, consumer says not mine, if that's the code that was there, and they convey that over to the furnisher. So that's kind of where I'm heading with you, is like, in that case, then the furnisher, you would think, would have a good defense. They're like, well, look, I mean, the bureau sent us a code that said not mine, and we looked in our records and we confirmed reasonably that it was the consumer's, and so we did our job. So yeah, you're not going to see any of the data changing, even though the consumer's dispute to the bureau may have said like date of first delinquency is missing, right? It may have been something entirely different. So does that scenario play into how you're evaluating things, or are you not so much really looking at how the information is conveyed from the bureau to the furnisher?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't recall that, say, specific scenario coming up. But I think when you were talking about that, I sort of thought back to listening to John Watt on his show with you about talking to all your watchers and listeners to be as specific as you can in the letters that they write in as far as the disputes are concerned. Because I think back 10 years ago, and I think some of the information about filling out dispute letters was, sort of like John had, I think, commented something about, people were more vague in their dispute letters 10 years ago than they are today.
Right.
When you have John Watts coming out there and saying, hey, be as specific, be as detailed as you can, so that, if it isn't corrected or isn't modified correctly or reported accurately, you have a case.
Right.
So I think I really agreed with John when he said that. And I was like, as credit repair companies, that's really important. I think it supports, if it ends up in my lap and I end up being an expert on the case, it makes an argument stronger if the more detailed you are. And
and that's what I share with folks. And in my training course, that's what I teach with CROs is, you've got to, you really need to look at the data, and you put the data, the errors that are on the actual errors, and put that in the credit dispute letter and send the bureau's notice of that. And if there's 10 data fields that are wrong, you want to put them on notice. But then kind of the unanswered question that I think you're scratching your head on, because I think you're pondering it, is, okay, so if you send a dispute to the bureaus that says 12 different data fields are inaccurate or inconsistent or incomplete or jacked up when you compare to 3 bureaus, how do they take that and convey that information to the furnisher, right? Like, what are the breakdowns in the systems? Because the FCRA requires that they forward all relevant information, right? And that's where I think would be really interesting, because now they do send, my understanding is they send scanned images of the disputes to the furnishers, but they also still they select, any number from their 30 eOscar codes. So you've got an eOscar code system and you have a scanned image going over to the furnisher. And, when you get your first case where that's what you're looking at, let me know, because that'll be some good subject matter, I think, for one of our Doug Miner expert witness shows there. So,
well, I think, Steve, you raise a good point in that if I had a case, or when it probably more accurate might be that when a case like that sort of comes across my desk, or if something along those lines comes across, yeah, give me an opportunity to maybe give your viewers a little bit more insight on
I
something like.
mean, it's a very simple method uh, that that I share with folks. I mean, if you look at the trade line
Yeah,
on all three bureaus, and you get even their little paper reports directly from the bureaus, Metro 2 is their standard, and they design that standard to conform to the FCRA, which requires maximum possible accuracy. So if the law requires maximum possible accuracy, and they have one standard that all three bureaus have adopted, and you look at the trade line reporting on all three bureaus, and their little templates look different, and the format is different, and they don't even give you all the fields and all the bureaus. I mean, it's very easy to send that, to audit that, send it over to the bureaus and say, dear bureaus, this Capital One, as an example, trade line is reporting these three different ways. Please either delete it or give me my industry standard accurate report. And you're never going to get that unless and until these credit bureaus change their templates, right? And that's so, for anybody and a lot of folks who are in our community here that are disputing that way, that's a big thing, is putting them on notice. Hey, I don't even need to know what's right and what's wrong. I just know that it can't be reporting all these different ways. And the curious thing is when you send those over to the bureaus, that's what I'm really curious about in kind of this day, and with what you see, you know, what is, can they use the fact that they actually transfer images over to the furnisher to basically bypass the fact that they may have sent an e-Oscar code that said not mine, even though nothing in the dispute said not mine. It was like these 10 fields are wrong. How do they balance what the e-Oscar code that they've selected says versus what the actual dispute says and stuff like that. But I'm sure you'll have some of those coming down the pipeline, as this pre-litigation community grows and expands and stuff from there. And so, man, hard to believe we've had almost a good solid hour here, Doug. And,
yeah,
so as we kind of wrap this show up, I know we wanted to talk a little bit about, when the phone rings, how do you handle the conversation with the attorney? And, I think we had some pretty good conversation there. For those folks who are watching and listening, who may want to get more information from you, folks who are interested in taking their credit repair business and diversifying and also putting themselves out there as an expert, an extra income stream, an extra credibility thing as well. What do you have available for folks? I know you said before you do some kind of one-on-one training and stuff like that. How can you help folks who may be interested in pursuing a journey of trying to become an expert witness?
yeah. So I do one-on-one training as far as teaching them to take the from step one to the end, right? To be someone like me, be able to do cases and get qualified. And so I do have a course where I do teach that to people, and I have done some group situations as well. And we'll see how things go, obviously, with COVID and so forth. And hopefully at some point we can do, more of an in-person situation. But they can reach out to me, just Google my name. You can go to my website or contact me through Facebook, however is easier for you. And I'm happy to answer questions. Some of the viewers have, messaged me or sent me questions or different things. And that's great. I love it. I, I wish there was somebody like me back 10 years ago to talk to. Right.
If there was somebody like you, then you wouldn't be you, right? That's what gets us where we are, is the journey, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what's your email address? How can they get in touch with you if they want to reach out?
Yeah. I think so this is what I've been doing lately. My easiest one is Doug@dougminer.com.
And it's
Super simple. Yeah.
DOUGMINOR, right?
Yeah. OR. Yeah.
MINOR.com. Very cool. So, well, Doug@dougminer.com. And so Doug's been doing this for ages, wealth of experience. For those of you guys who are watching, he's an open door and an open book. He's willing to help and talk to folks. As he said, there's not very many people in this field, and there's a lot of opportunity to get more experts out there. And for those of you guys who are also interested in learning more about pre-litigation disputes, we do have our training course as well. Feel free to message me, or you can email me, Steven@StevenPalmieri.com. And that being said, we appreciate you guys for watching. Doug, I appreciate you taking some time out of the golf course over there in beautiful California to spend with us and our audience. And we will see you guys on the next video. Take care.